The air was thick with the acrid stench of decay, a constant reminder of the world's slow, agonizing demise. For the survivors of the undead plague, the earth itself had become a battleground, a war of attrition between the last vestiges of humanity and the ravenous horde that had once been their neighbors, friends, and families. Vera wiped the sweat from her brow as she crouched behind a dilapidated car, her eyes scanning the horizon through a broken window. The ruins of what had once been a thriving city lay sprawled before her, cracked buildings, overturned vehicles, and the faintest whispers of movement. The silence was deafening, punctuated only by the distant groans of the undead. She had learned to live with this silence, to embrace the stillness that surrounded her. The occasional scream would break through, but it was no longer a surprise. It was just part of the world they now inhabited. Vera had been on her own for 2 months, after the last of her group had been wiped out in a brutal ambush. It had been a massacre, an act of desperation from an enemy that knew no mercy. With only her resourcefulness and sharp instincts to guide her, she had survived, moving from place to place, scavenging, hiding, and fighting when necessary. But every day was a battle, and hope was a fragile thing. The wind rustled through the broken streets, sending debris scattering like tumbleweeds. Vera's gaze shifted toward a nearby alleyway. She had heard a noise earlier, something unnatural, like a faint scraping sound. Holding her breath, she stood up and slowly crept toward the alley, her hand tightly gripping the hilt of a makeshift knife she had fashioned from an old scrap of metal. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached the source of the sound, each step measured and deliberate. The world had become one giant game of cat and mouse, and she had learned not to trust anything. Not the silence, not the shadows, especially not the eerie, ragged movements of the undead. The alley was empty, save for a few toppled garbage bins. She took a cautious step forward, her eyes darting to every corner, every crevice, her ears strained to pick up any hint of danger. Suddenly, the scraping noise returned, louder this time. She whirled around, her pulse quickening. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw something moving. A figure, human, or at least, it looked human. She froze. The person was limping, their movements slow and erratic, their clothes torn and blood-stained. "Please, help me," the figure rasped, its voice barely above a whisper. Vera's grip on her knife tightened. She had learned to trust no one. But something in the voice, something desperate, tugged at her, and against her better judgment, she stepped forward. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with suspicion. The figure raised its head, revealing a gaunt face. I'm just trying to survive. I've been hiding from them. I don't know how much longer I can last." Vera's mind raced. She knew she should leave, that helping this stranger could be the end of her. But the look in the person's eyes, wide, terrified, but still human, stopped her. She had seen too many people lose that spark. Too many people become lost to the undead's insatiable hunger. This one was still holding on. "Where did you come from?" Vera asked, her voice softening despite herself. "I was part of a group," the stranger whispered, stumbling toward her. "But they turned on me. The others were changed. They didn't even look like people anymore. And I ran. I've been running ever since." Vera could see the desperation in the stranger's eyes, the fear, the hopelessness. She hesitated, her instincts battling with her compassion. There was no time to waste, but leaving someone behind to die, no matter how dangerous, didn't sit right with her. "You can come with me," Vera said finally, her voice barely audible over the wind. "But you need to keep up, and you need to follow my lead. We don't have time to argue." The stranger nodded weakly, tears streaking down their dirt-covered face. "Thank you." Vera took a deep breath and glanced over her shoulder, scanning the streets once more. Every moment felt like an eternity, every shadow a potential threat. The undead were out there, waiting for any sign of weakness. And now, Vera had just added another potential danger to her growing list of problems. Still, she couldn't leave someone to die when there was a chance, no matter how small, that they could survive. The two survivors moved quickly through the wreckage, their steps echoing in the eerie stillness. Vera's mind raced as she considered their next move. She could take the stranger to the old safe house, a building further downtown that had held up against the horde in the past, or she could risk staying in the ruins longer and attempt to scavenge more supplies. As they rounded a corner, a sudden shout echoed from behind them, shattering the fragile silence. Vera froze, instinctively pulling the stranger closer as her heart leaped into her throat. They had company. The shout echoed through the ruins like a thunderclap, the sound bouncing off the crumbling buildings and piercing the heavy silence that had settled around them. Vera's heart hammered in her chest as she spun toward the direction of the sound, her mind already racing through possible scenarios. "Stay down," she hissed to the stranger, her voice sharp as a blade. She pushed him behind a stack of fallen bricks, her hand clutching her makeshift knife tightly. There was no time to waste. The shout had come from further down the street, but there was no mistaking what it meant. Humans were out there, living, breathing survivors, but were they friend or foe? In this world, the line was often blurred. Desperation had turned some people into monsters, just as much as the undead had. Vera's mind flicked back to the days when she had traveled in a group, before the ambush, before the betrayal. The people she had once trusted had turned on her in a heartbeat when supplies ran low. It had been a brutal lesson in survival. Trust no one, not even those who seemed as desperate as you. But there was something different about this shout. It didn't sound like the growls or screeches of the undead. It sounded human. Yet, human voices had their own dangers now. Vera crouched low, peeking around the edge of the crumbled wall, trying to discern any movement. She saw nothing at first, but the feeling of being watched crept up her spine, a familiar sensation she had grown to trust over the months of surviving this hellish new world. A rustle came from behind a shattered car a few meters away. Then a silhouette emerged, a figure in torn clothing, face obscured by the shadow of a hood. Vera's hand tightened on the knife, her breath coming in shallow bursts. The figure paused, seemingly sensing her presence. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, the figure spoke. "Who's there?" The voice was low, cautious, but there was no immediate aggression in it. Vera's eyes narrowed. She couldn't make out their face, but the tone in the voice was enough to suggest they weren't part of the undead horde. Still, that didn't mean they were trustworthy. She had to play this carefully. "It's just me," Vera called back, her voice steady but cold. "Stay where you are." The figure didn't move for a long moment, and the silence that followed was thick with tension. Vera could hear the faint rustle of wind through the abandoned city, the distant shuffle of the undead, but the figure remained still, waiting for her next move. Finally, the figure stepped forward slightly, revealing more of their face. A young man, no older than 20, with a scruffy beard and dirt-smeared skin. His eyes were wide with caution, but there was a spark of desperation in them, a familiar look that Vera knew all too well. "I'm not looking for trouble," the man said, his voice shaking slightly. "Just food, water, whatever you can spare." Vera didn't answer right away. She studied him, weighing her options. She could take the man down easily if she had to, but the fact that he had not lunged at her or shown signs of hostility gave her pause. For a moment, she thought about the stranger hiding behind the rubble. Could she risk helping another person? Her instincts screamed that helping this man could lead to disaster, but there was also something that tugged at her, the human part of her that wanted to believe there was still good left in the world. "Why should I help you?" she asked, her voice cutting through the still air. "This is a dangerous world. People aren't always what they seem." The young man's gaze flickered briefly toward the rubble, where the stranger was hiding, then back to her. He swallowed hard, his eyes pleading. "Because I'm not alone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There are more of us, a small group just trying to survive." We won't hurt you. We need help. Vera's mind raced. A group. That could be a risk, but it also meant there were numbers. Strength in numbers. Still, she couldn't ignore the warning bells going off in her head. Too many times had she been burned by trusting others. She took a step closer, keeping her distance, her eyes scanning his movements. "What kind of group?" she asked. "What's your plan?" The young man hesitated for a moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. "We've set up camp in the old church downtown. It's fortified. We've got food, water, medical supplies, but not enough. We're barely holding on." Vera's pulse quickened. The old church. She had heard rumors of a group holed up there, but she had always assumed they were just another band of scavengers fighting for dominance over the last scraps of civilization. But this man didn't look like a raider. He looked broken, like someone who had seen too much. "And why come to me?" Vera asked, narrowing her eyes. "Why not stay there?" The man shifted uncomfortably, his face tense. "Because we've been spotted. The undead are closing in on the church. We can't hold it for much longer." The word hung heavy in the air between them. Vera could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on her. She could turn him away, keep to herself, but the thought of the church falling, of people being wiped out, stirred something in her. "We need to move now," Vera said, her decision made. "But if you're lying, if this is some kind of trick." The young man shook his head vigorously. "I swear on my life. We need help. Please." She nodded sharply, then turned to the stranger hiding behind the rubble. "We're going to the church. Stay close, and keep your head down." With one last glance at the man, Vera set off toward the wreckage of the city's heart, her eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. Behind her, the man followed, and the stranger limped along quietly, as if he too could feel the looming danger. But with every step they took toward the church, Vera couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into the jaws of something much worse than they could ever imagine. The journey to the church was silent, save for the soft scuff of their footsteps on the cracked pavement and the occasional rustle of wind-stirring debris. The streets were eerily deserted, with only the occasional shadow of the undead shuffling aimlessly through the wreckage. They kept their distance from those creatures, moving with purpose but cautiously, never straying too far from cover. Vera's mind raced as they neared the church. She couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. The young man, who had introduced himself as Liam, had been quiet after they set off. He kept glancing nervously over his shoulder, as though expecting something to follow them. Vera kept a close watch on him, her instincts still screaming that trusting him was a gamble. The church loomed ahead, a dark, crumbling silhouette against the blood-red sky. The once proud structure had been fortified with a mix of metal scrap, wooden planks, and what appeared to be old furniture. A rusty, makeshift gate stood at the entrance, half covered by overgrown vines. "Is this it?" Vera asked, her voice cutting through the tension as they reached the base of the steps leading up to the church. Liam nodded, his eyes scanning the area nervously. "Yes, this is where we've been hiding. But it's not safe anymore. The undead are getting closer, and we've heard rumors of raiders in the area too." Vera stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the fortified doors. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. If the rumors about the church being a sanctuary for survivors were true, it was a last-ditch effort at salvation. If they were false, it was a death trap. She approached the gate, hesitant but determined, and knocked once, firmly. Moments later, the sound of bolts being undone echoed from the other side. The door creaked open, revealing a man, older than Vera, with a rough, weathered face and tired eyes. He wore a tattered military vest and carried an old rifle slung over his shoulder. "Who's there?" The man's voice was hoarse, laced with suspicion. "It's Liam," the young man said quickly. "I found someone. We need help." The man at the gate narrowed his eyes, looking past Liam, at Vera and the stranger who was still limping behind her. Vera could see the skepticism in his eyes, the calculation. He wasn't about to let them in without a reason. "Why should I let you in?" the man asked, his grip tightening on the rifle. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Vera said, stepping forward and meeting the man's gaze. "I'm just looking for a place to rest. We've been on the run for days." The man's gaze lingered on her for a long moment, as though trying to read her every intention. Finally, he sighed and stepped back, unlocking the final bolt. "Come in," he muttered, stepping aside to let them through. The church was dimly lit, with only a few candles flickering in the corners of the room. It had clearly been repurposed into a makeshift shelter, with sleeping bags, crates of supplies, and improvised barricades scattered around the space. A few people were gathered near the far wall, talking in low voices. The air was thick with tension. Vera's eyes darted around, taking in the scene. There were no windows, and only the faintest hint of daylight filtered through cracks in the stone walls. In the corner of the room, a woman sat with a medical kit, tending to a child. Near the altar, a man was sharpening a knife, his eyes never leaving the edge of his blade. The man at the gate, now revealed to be the group's leader, gestured toward a corner of the room. "You can rest over there. But don't get comfortable. We're not here for long." Vera nodded, her gaze flicking between the people in the church. She didn't trust any of them. Trust had been shattered long ago, but she had no choice. This was their best shot at surviving another day. Liam led her and the stranger to the corner where they could sit. He still seemed uneasy, glancing nervously at the others in the room. As they settled down, the group leader approached, his eyes fixed on Vera. "We have a deal," he said. "If you're staying, you work. Everyone here pulls their weight. We have food and water, but it's limited. The undead are closing in, and we've been hearing whispers of raiders in the area. We can't afford to be weak." "I'm not weak," Vera said, her voice firm. "What do you need?" The leader gave a sharp nod. "There's a stash of supplies hidden in the basement. We've got to move them up here before nightfall. The undead are more active after dark." Vera's mind flicked to the shadows outside. Nightfall was only hours away, and if they didn't act quickly, the church could become a trap. "Fine," she said, standing up. "I'll help, but no one leaves this place unless they're ready to defend it. We don't know who, or what, is out there." The group leader's lips curled into something that might have been a smile, though it lacked warmth. "You've got the right idea. Come with me." He led her toward the back of the church, and as they passed the others, Vera noticed their wary glances. Fear was a common currency in this world, and she could feel the distrust in the air. But there was something else, too, something darker. A kind of coldness that came from having survived too long without hope. In the basement, Vera saw the hidden stash. It wasn't much: some canned food, bottles of water, a few basic medical supplies, and a couple of old weapons. It wasn't the kind of hoard one would expect from survivors trying to hold their ground. It was a pitiful attempt at staying alive in a world that didn't care anymore. As Vera began to move the supplies toward the stairs, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. The church, though fortified, felt like a sinking ship. There was no way they were the only ones who knew about this place. The question wasn't if they would be attacked, but when. With the supplies gathered, they made their way back upstairs, the creaking of the stairs under their feet amplifying the silence around them. They'd reached the top just as the light outside began to fade, the sky dimming to a murky gray. The group was preparing for what was coming, and Vera couldn't help but wonder, when the storm hit, would it be the undead that finished them off, or something far worse lurking in the shadows of their new sanctuary? The night had fallen, thick and oppressive, as the church grew quieter, the faint hum of the wind outside now blending with the anxious, almost palpable tension inside. The air was heavy with the smell of sweat, fear, and the faint odor of mildew, reminders of just how long they'd been trapped in this deteriorating world. The candlelight flickered erratically, casting long, sinister shadows that made every creak of the floorboards seem louder, more threatening. Vera stood near the entrance, her back against the wall as she watched the survivors prepare for the worst. Liam, the young man who had led her to this place, was speaking with the group leader, a burly man named Gregor. They were discussing their next move, but Vera couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Gregor's face was grim, his eyes hard, and she couldn't tell if it was the weight of the situation or something more sinister in his intentions. She had noticed, over the past few hours, how the group seemed more on edge. The walls were lined with improvised weapons, knives, bats, broken rifles, and every few minutes, someone would glance out the narrow boarded-up window or check the barricades, as if expecting an attack at any moment. The stranger Vera had brought with her earlier, still limping and pale, was sitting in a corner, nursing a swollen ankle. He hadn't said much, but Vera could tell that he was just as uncertain about the group as she was. Something didn't sit right with her about all this. "Vera," a voice whispered from behind her. It was Liam, his voice low and urgent. "I need to talk to you." She turned, giving him a quick nod, and followed him down a narrow corridor, away from the others. They moved quickly, keeping their voices low. The last thing they needed was to draw attention. "What's going on?" Vera asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You seem nervous." Liam glanced over his shoulder to make sure no one was listening before speaking again. "There's something you don't know about Gregor. I think he's hiding something. He's not as trustworthy as he's letting on." Vera's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" Liam hesitated before speaking again, his voice shaky. Before the outbreak, Gregor was part of a militia. They were supposed to be a group of survivors trying to protect others. But he turned, into something else. "I've seen how he's willing to make deals, even with the raiders. I don't trust him. And there's something about this place." He trailed off, looking around nervously. Vera's mind raced. If Gregor and his group were hiding something, if they were involved with raiders or worse, it could spell disaster for everyone. "How do you know this?" she asked. Liam sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I used to be part of a group that was close to his. They were the ones who warned us about him, but we couldn't leave. When everything started going south, I ran. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was brewing here. And when I found you, when I saw how strong you were, well, I thought maybe we could figure it out together." Vera's pulse quickened. She didn't want to believe it, but the pieces were starting to fall into place. Gregor's cold, calculating nature, the way he kept everything tightly controlled. The group was scared, and fear often led people to do terrible things in this world. The last thing she needed was to become a pawn in some twisted power game. "I'll keep my eye on him," Vera said finally, her voice low. "But we need to be careful. No sudden moves. If he's dangerous, we don't want to start a fight we can't finish." Liam nodded. "Thank you." Just as they were about to turn back, a loud crash echoed from the front of the church. A burst of panicked shouts followed, cutting through the building like a knife. Vera's heart leaped into her throat. "The doors. Get to the barricades." Gregor's voice rang out from the other side of the building, his tone urgent. "It's the undead. Move, now." Without a second thought, Vera dashed toward the main room, Liam following closely behind. The sound of scraping and shuffling grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable groans and snarls of the undead. They were closing in. As she entered the main area of the church, Vera saw chaos unfolding before her eyes. Gregor and the other survivors were scrambling to fortify the barricades, but it was clear they weren't going to hold for long. The door had already begun to splinter, and there were too many of them. Too many undead pressing against the wooden planks. The stench of rot was overpowering. "Get to the back," Gregor barked, pushing people toward the rear of the church. "We can't hold them off for long." But Vera's eyes were fixed on the door. She had a feeling. A gut instinct that this wasn't just a random attack. The undead didn't act this quickly. Something had drawn them here. Something that wasn't just chance. Liam moved beside her, and she glanced at him. Something's wrong. This isn't just a random horde. They're being herded. Liam's face paled. You think? Get ready. Vera cut him off, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife at her side. We're not alone here. Just as she spoke, the door broke open with a deafening crash, and the undead flooded into the church. Their hollow eyes and twisted limbs were barely visible through the cracks in the barricades. But it didn't matter. They were here. Vera moved quickly, slashing at the first two figures that made it through. The sound of tearing flesh filled the room as the undead collapsed to the ground, their bodies twitching with the death rattle that still echoed in their decaying forms. The group was in full chaos, fighting to push the creatures back. But Vera couldn't stop thinking. How had they found the church so quickly? How had the horde been herded directly to them? The answer came in a flash of recognition. Gregor had known about the attack. He had led them here. And now, with the church's defenses crumbling, he had orchestrated their downfall. You knew. Vera shouted at Gregor, who stood by the doorway, watching the chaos unfold. His lips curled into a twisted smile. You planned this. Gregor laughed, a low, mocking sound. What's the point of surviving if you can't make a little profit? Those raiders I warned you about. They're mine. And now, we all get to play. With that, the truth came crashing down. The undead weren't the only threat here. The real enemy was the man they had trusted, the one who had led them straight into a trap. Vera's heart raced. She turned toward the group, determined to protect them. But now the fight was even more desperate. Survival was no longer just about battling the undead. It was about facing the twisted betrayals of humanity itself. And as the church fell to chaos, Vera knew one thing for certain. This fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning.